Hello, my name is Alex Isles, and in today's episode we're going to be talking about sites of the Great Heathen Army in Mercia. Welcome back. So in today's episode we're talking about the Great Heathen Army and two of the sites they stayed in Mercia. So in previous episodes we've talked about the invasion and what they did, but over time archaeologists have gone around the British Isles and they've looked for evidence to basically say, where can we back up the historical sources that we have, things like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and stuff like that, and then back it up with physical archaeology and say, yes, this is a site where we know the Great Heathen Army was. Now, what they've done is over time they've been very lucky and they've had a combination of digs at sites around the British Isles, and alongside this as well, metal detectorist finds that have then enabled for follow-up archaeology to discover more about this fascinating period in history. So we're going to be talking about a place called Torsley in Lincolnshire, and then following on from that we're going to be talking about Repton. So if you like the sound of that, why not you subscribe now, because there's plenty more content like this on the channel and I think you'll enjoy it here. But in the meantime, let's jump right into this. So we're going to talk about Torsley in Lincolnshire. So you can see right here, this is Torsley, and then it is in Lincolnshire. When it's in Lincolnshire, it's quite an important location because it's one of the sites where the Great Heathen Army stayed in 872. And so this is what the site of Torsley would have been like in 872 AD. Now it's a defensible raised area just above the River Trent, and that enabled for the Scandinavians to have quick movement up and down the river and also have access to nearby ecclesiastical sites and royal palaces. So the Great Heathen Army had now a place to stay over the winter that was defensible, and alongside that as well to basically project their power onto local Mercian sites during their stay there. Now, when they're staying in that area, as I mentioned before, it was quite an important site, and after the Great Heathen Army, it turned into one of the most important sites in the north of England for Anglo-Saxon pottery, and they actually start using continental technology. So there's a possibility that some of the people who maybe came across from Frisia, from what is the modern day Netherlands, Francia, places like that, would have brought with them the technology across into Lincolnshire, and then from that developed into a very important location for Anglo-Saxon pottery post the Great Heathen Army. So that shows you again an influence of how the Scandinavians, as they migrated into the British Isles, would have then settled, incorporated themselves, and then bettered the local place by developing new technologies, new industries, and helping to grow what would eventually become Anglo-Saxon England. So metal detectorists started finding small items in fields, and this then led to a follow-up dig by York University. And if you would like to read the dig in more full, the actual evidence is right here, and I've tried to cite that so you can then find the paper, and so you can look through the finds they discovered in and around the fields in Lincolnshire. So it's a really interesting paper if you're into your archaeology, and hopefully that's given you more than enough time so you can pause the video if you like, find the paper and read up on it, and maybe look at some of the items while I continue talking. Over the course of the archaeological dig, they discovered 1,500 items, of which 300 were coins, and 100 of those coins were stickers, which is a type of Northumbrian coin. Now this is really interesting because it shows that the Great Heathen host was actually in Northumbria, because the sticker is not generally found outside of Northumbria. It's a little copper coin, and so when it's not found outside of Northumbria, that shows that they had picked up money there, and now they were processing it here at this site. Alongside this as well, hundreds of Arabic coins were also found, and they were cut up into pieces for their hack silver value. Now, to explain hack silver, it's when you take a coin and you melt it down or break it or cut it into pieces for the value it has in its actual metal rather than its value it has within the current country as set by that government. So in modern terms, our coins don't have that much precious metal within them. So if we melt them down, we don't get much monetary value from our coins. But in the past, coins were made of copper and gold and silver. So you can actually melt them down for their value as a metal. And so these coins had been brought over from Scandinavia with the Great Heathen host, and now were being processed at this site in Torsley. Now, when they were being processed alongside this as well, they found lots of Anglo-Saxon, Irish and Frankish silver on the site. So it shows that they were taking all of this different metal that they had basically taken from across in mainland Europe, across in Scandinavia, in Ireland, in the west coast of Scotland and in England as well. And they were processing all of this silver at this site. And so the Great Heathen Host had a huge amount of monetary wealth. If they've discovered 1,500 items, and this was the items that were dropped or lost, the other wealth that must have been on this site must have been absolutely huge. And so we really get a sense of what the Great Heathen Host was able to do and the monetary value they were carrying with them in 872. What we'll do now is we'll jump on from Torsley to Repton, and we'll discuss Repton as a site and what it means for us as we study the Great Heathen Host. Now this is the second site, and Repton was a location where the Great Heathen Army stayed in 873 AD. Now when they stayed there in 873, the site was discovered in the 1970s, and over 200 bodies or burials were discovered at the site. Now there's an interesting factor here about archaeology, because they did carbon dating on the bodies, but there's a really wonderful thing about science is that we always have to keep learning and discovering more as we go along. But if someone has a lot of fish in their diet, this can actually throw out carbon dating by almost 200 years in some cases. So because of this, when they analysed the site, what they discovered was that they looked at the carbon dates of these bodies and they were put right into the early Middle Ages, sort of the post-Roman period. But as technology moved on, they reanalyzed, recarbon dated these burials and bones, and they got a date that was very close to when we would expect the Great Heathen Host to have been in and around Repton, so that date of 873 AD. Now, when they looked at these graves, what they discovered was that half of the graves showed signs of violence. So these people had been Scandinavians who had fought and died, probably maybe died of infection or other diseases, or possibly even died in battle, and so they were buried here at Repton, which was actually quite a large Scandinavian site. You just have to look behind me, and this is a reconstruction of what they think it looked like, because later on they built a church. It was a D-shaped palisaded site with access to the river, so you can see down here with the reconstruction they've got the longships down there, and then the tented settlement just behind me right here. And so when they looked at that, it showed about half of the graves had actually died in violent means, and then alongside this as well, 20% of the graves were actually women of Anglo-Saxon descent, which is a really interesting one as well, because it shows that local people were joining with the Scandinavian invaders and were actually starting a new life with them, and they had actually perished either due to disease within the camp or other factors as well, just due to normal life, or they could have possibly been slaves who were gathered up as well. When they were doing the digs as well, they discovered two graves of very high status Scandinavians, and one was probably anywhere between 35 to 45 years old, and the other one was 17 to 20 years old, both men. When they were high-ranking Scandinavians, they were buried with swords and also their jewellery. And the older man had had a cut across his body from hip across to his thigh, and during that, it looks like his penis and his testicles would have been separated from his body. So when they'd been separated from his body, a boar tusk, a wild pig, had been placed where his penis would have been. And so maybe that was to repair or to restore his body that had been damaged during the actual blow that had killed him. Now, the interesting thing is that these two bodies can be associated with actual evidence that we have from that time. And the Scandinavians staying at Repton were staying there for a number of years. They developed a settlement and they stayed in and around that site and came back and wintered there a number of times. And these two men are thought to be Olaf, who was thought to be Ivar the Boneless, or Eimar, his actual name, his brother, and alongside this as well, his son, Eimstein. Now, the interesting thing about this is that we know that Olaf died in 874 fighting against the Britons up in what is now modern-day Scotland. And when he fought against them, he was killed in battle. And then his son died in conflict against Halfdan, and he dies in 875. And so the first one, Olaf, is buried, and then the burial is then disturbed, and the second burial is placed in alongside the second one. So we can see that when Olaf dies, they then bury his son side by side with him. And so that shows a connection between these two men of high status. And so it's wonderful when you're actually able to combine together these different parts of history from chronicles and sources like that to actually help to create, you know, an actual fuller understanding, because we have the burials of these two. And what they did is they actually reconstructed the face of the older man, and so this could be Olaf, the brother of Aimar, and that's a really interesting one right there. And so a little bit of dark history alongside this is just next to the graves, there were 4 children who had died and their bodies showed signs of extreme trauma. And it's likely they were actually sacrifices to accompany these 2 great heathen warriors to Valhalla. So you can see again this effect of the Scandinavian paganism being basically used, and that sort of like that violence to take these children's lives to then sort of accompanying sacrifices, because we have records of other people like slaves and animals being sacrificed alongside other Scandinavians when they died as well. So it's a darker part of history. It's definitely not a nice part of history, but we have that sort of evidence there that suggests a sacrifice alongside these 2 men. Now the whole camp in Repton actually was about half a kilometre squared and was actually quite a large camp, and it was enough for a few hundred if not thousand warriors to gather together to actually basically use it as a winter base before they would then campaign around other parts of the British Isles. But with this we've got this amazing sort of transition where we can see the great heathen host and the conflicts between the 2 sides, and how leaders like Olaf and his son are being honoured and with burials at the site, and later on they would build a church dedicated to St. Weiston. And so we can see how the Anglo-Saxons later took over this palisade enclosure and then continued to develop that area as well as an Anglo-Saxon settlement, which has then continued to be occupied right until this day in Repton. So if you'd like to read about that, it was actually done by the University of Bristol's Archaeology and Anthropology Society. They've got research papers on it, and it was led by a woman called Kat Yarman. And so if you look up her, Dr. Kat Yarman, she has got the research and the information about this going on. So definitely a good one to look at as well. So it's a really interesting one again when we actually are able to look at these recorded events that we actually have from things like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, from the stories of this time, and we can put it all together so that we understand the past better with a combination of archaeology, written sources, and alongside this as well, modern science with things like carbon dating, so we can fully understand the lives of these people in the past. I really hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have done, please do like and subscribe. Why not share the videos with your friends? And if you would like to, you can support me, because in the description I've got a Patreon and also a Ko-fi, but again, no pressure whatsoever, only if you'd want to. Thank you so much for your time today and watching the video, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. But until next time, stay safe and well.